Should you buy a vintage receiver? Or any receiver? Welcome to Lancaster Hi-Fi. Let's talk about receivers. First, we need to define both receiver and vintage receiver. I'll go on to address both the merits and demerits of receivers in general and vintage receivers specifically, and I'll talk briefly about some other options. What's a receiver? That used to be a simple question. Receivers combine preamp, power amp, and radio in one case. With just a receiver and speakers, you could listen to music. Nowadays, receivers have taken on more functions and may include streamers and DACs and not even have built-in tuners, i.e. radios. Let's broadly define receiver then as integrated amp, i.e. preamp plus power amp, plus at least one source, such as a radio or a streamer DAC combo. With a receiver and speakers, you can listen to music. I'll acknowledge that AV receivers are a thing, and I won't specifically exclude them from the receiver category, but I won't address them specifically. So, we've got working definitions of receiver and vintage receiver. Receiver is integrated amp plus source, and in a vintage receiver, that source is a radio tuner. Since receivers include sources, receivers also provide a user interface to that source, and typically a display of some kind. Vintage receivers, especially if we limit vintage to the analog era, generally include those glowy dial faces and knobs or wheels that both move a pointer across the dial face and make the physical adjustments necessary to change stations. Modern receivers might have small screens that respond to the knobs and buttons, or the app on your phone, used to control the built-in streamer. The WIM amp is really a receiver, albeit one without a display. Receivers, whether vintage or modern, are judged in part by the aesthetic appeal of the interfaces. That is, the glowy dial faces of vintage receivers and the screen displays of modern receivers. In between, we can find receivers with rather unattractive digital tuner displays. Maybe you're a fan of the minimalist aesthetic embodied by this NAD receiver, but I didn't buy it for its looks. But let's stop beating around the bush and talk about the tuners inside of vintage receivers with those pretty dial faces. Personally, I rarely listen to the radio. Sometimes I listen to the radio when I'm driving in town, but most of the time I use Bluetooth to listen to music on my phone when I'm driving. In the house, I only listen to the radio when I'm testing vintage receivers. Can we admit, then, that the dial faces on vintage receivers are just for show? Do you, to those of you who use a vintage receiver, ever use it to listen to the radio? Really? Still? In 2024? Me? Hardly ever. Facts is facts. That said, we still use vintage receivers in this house. I have a Marantz 2252 in the living room. My younger son has a Pioneer SX440 in his room. My older son has a Pioneer SX828. These receivers all have working tuners that are never used. But dang, those glowy dial faces sure are pretty. Oh, and this Pioneer SX850 behind me here? It's in for repair. I'm just using this system to give it an extended listening test. Normally, I'd be using my tube power amps with this phase linear preamp. It's a similar situation in my home office where I'm using a combination preamp tuner with a broken tuner as a preamp for a tube power amp. So I'm afraid that whereas the pretty glowy dial faces are attractive merits of vintage receivers, their built-in tuners don't really count as significant merits. And in the absence of, say, built-in streamers and or DACs, count as a demerit. Yes, the vintage receiver is effectively just an integrated amp with an attractive, albeit superfluous, dial face. Hey, I don't mean to suggest that you're somehow wrong or out of step if you listen to the radio and, moreover, use a vintage receiver to do so. Where I live, there aren't many stations worth listening to, and people in rural areas may not be able to tune in any stations at all. However, those of you near larger urban centers may have some good stations you enjoy listening to. Still, the audio quality of FM radio isn't great. How many of you have had an experience like this one? My son brought home a copy of Boston's first album, which I had only ever heard on the radio. I gave it a quick cleaning and put it on the turntable, and we sat on the couch and listened to it together. Played on a good turntable, the songs that were familiar from radio airplay sounded so different that I thought the mix must be different. But no, radio audio quality just kind of sucks. Yes, the other components matter, as does the listening environment, and radio can sound pretty good. I'll never forget one time I demonstrated my dad's system. I turned it on and switched to the tuner. I just happened to tune in at the beginning of Money for Nothing by Dire Straits. It was the summer of 1985, after all. I cranked it up in time to hear Mark Knopfler's epic opening riff, and it sounded friggin' epic on that system. But that was an epic system. Macintosh FM tuner with tubes, kit-built tube preamp, Macintosh tube power amp, monster drivers, and Electro Voice corner cabinets. For what that system cost, of course it sounded amazing. Okay, so radio can sound good, but I still don't listen to the radio at home. If vintage receivers are effectively just pretty integrated amps, are those integrated amps good enough to justify themselves? Do they rate as integrated amps? In general, yes, they do. In my experience, vintage receivers are as good as comparable integrated amps. That is, the receivers offer similar sound quality and features. To get a significant bump in sound quality and features over vintage receivers, you got to step up to separates, separate preamp and power amp. Now, if my receiver or a receiver I like has a preamp with good sound and adequate features, but I want to get a bump in sound quality, can I use that built-in preamp with a separate power amp? Maybe. It's complicated. First, and most importantly, does the receiver have pre-out main-in jacks on the back? If so, then you can use the preamp with a separate power amp, or you can use the power amp with a separate preamp. I built a tube power amp, a DG-SE1, for a friend, and he uses the preamp of an NAD integrated amp with the separate tube power amp. In the case of those two components, they're a good match, but that's not true in all cases. The DG-SE1 is sensitive enough that built-in preamps and most receivers can drive the DG-SE1 to full power, even with a turntable as the source. The DG-SE1 only needs half a volt RMS input to reach full power on the output. However, other amps I've built aren't that sensitive and require as much as 2 volts RMS input to reach full output power. If you only listen to CDs or streamers, then that 2 volt requirement isn't a problem, since most DACs have 2 volt or higher line level outputs. But I like listening to records, and the built-in preamps in most receivers don't deliver anywhere near 2 volts with phono input. More likely they'll deliver half a volt, maybe 1 volt, but maybe as little as 1 or 200 millivolts. Therefore, if you want to use the combination of turntable, a receiver's built-in preamp, and a separate power amp, you'll need to check the specs. See, there's a reason I use this preamp with a broken tuner to drive my Beaver Valley power amp. Well, I use the Adcom with the broken tuner or the Phase Linear 4000 because they're the only preamps I have that can drive the Beaver Valley to full power with phono input. Yeah, you really have to dig into the specs. Now, this problem isn't peculiar to receivers. Integrated amps have the same issue. You have been warned. You might be wondering, why would I choose a power amp with such low sensitivity? Because the low sensitivity allows enough negative feedback to make the sound good enough to be worth the trade-off. What about vintage receivers versus integrated amps? Do the integrated amps offer anything that the receivers don't? I hesitate to say it, and I could be wrong, but no, or barely anything. And by barely anything, I mean that not having a tuner in the case may have some benefit. At the least, if there's no tuner, then the built-in tuner can't break, because there isn't one. Right. And maybe a built-in tuner can crosstalk when other functions are selected? Maybe? But I think the differences are aesthetic, and that's about it. If the built-in tuners in vintage receivers are purely aesthetic and otherwise superfluous, what about modern receivers with built-in DACs and streamers? Yeah, those are big merits in favor of modern receivers. But at this point, we're really talking about different animals, aren't we? It seems to me that people choose modern receivers for utility and vintage receivers for reasons of aesthetic appeal and sound quality. If you only or mainly stream your music, and having the built-in streamer and DAC is the most important feature, then you're not even considering a vintage receiver. It's not in the running. That said, choosing a vintage receiver doesn't mean you can't stream music. You just won't have the streamer and DAC built in. I made a whole video about streaming with vintage systems, but the key bit here is that high-end, even middle-of-the-line vintage receivers have plenty of inputs to accommodate a streamer-DAC combo, plus a turntable or two, your TV, and a CD player. The function labels just won't be accurate. Here's an example to show you what I mean. This is my Marantz 2252 stereo receiver. Epic look, huh? With this, we can listen to sound from the TV, my streamer, or the CD player, and we're not even using the phono input. Let's see, we use tape 1 for the TV, tape 2 for the streamer, and aux for the CD player. If we were using a vintage integrated amp instead of a receiver, then we'd also have a tuner input that we could use. Yeah, this receiver only works in this role because it has inputs for 2 tape decks. Since one of the tape inputs has to be selected with the tape monitor switch instead of the regular function selector, it's not the most user-friendly solution for our home entertainment center needs. But come on, that dial face is something, isn't it? Okay, choose a vintage receiver for the looks and the sound, and choose one that can meet your needs, but realize that some compromises may be required. But you'll get that gorgeous dial face. Or will you? Damn it, I have to call out Sansui, and I love Sansui. Damn. The glowy, backlit dial faces of Sansui receivers only light up when tuner functions are selected. It's a friggin' tragic design flaw. For a while, with my Sansui 2000A, I got around this flaw by plugging my CD player into the tape inputs and listening to CDs with the function selector set to FM and the tape monitor button depressed. But one day I noticed that when the CD finished playing, I could hear the radio, even if only very faintly. With the volume cranked, the crosstalk was annoying enough for me to switch the CD to the aux inputs and go without having the dial face lit. But there's gotta be a way to mod the receiver to keep the dial lit. But then the receiver won't be in original condition. Oh no! Modding it might kill the resale value. So, I'm starting a campaign. Mod your Sansuis or request they be modded. And place a premium on that mod. All those beautiful Sansui dial faces out there unlit. It's a damn shame. So, I choose to use vintage receivers, right? Well, kind of. But I've been moving away from vintage receivers and towards separates. Because tubes. I love tube amps. Now, I do have this Sansui 1000 I've been working on. It's pretty sweet as a tube amp. And it doesn't have the dial face problem of the 70s Sansuis. I'm going to be giving this 1000 a try in one of my systems. It may be a keeper. We'll just have to see. Hey, thanks for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it or found it useful. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Share your own receiver stories in the comments. I do read all the comments and I'm pretty good about replying eventually. Have a great day and I'll talk to you soon.